Hey y'all, today's video we're gonna do some artistic activity. We're gonna do some coloring, possibly some painting, and we're gonna talk about the Black wealth gap. And yeah, and also eat some vegetable soup because I'll be eating my lunch as well. Alrighty, let's get into it. Hey y'all, so today we'll be talking about the Black wealth gap and coloring. Also, check it out. This tea kettle was a birthday present from my mom. Isn't it cute? I already placed the flowers because they were dying, and like I was doing like a ton of research for this video, so by the time that I was ready to do the video, the flowers, they were like not in the best condition. But yeah, it's a cute little teapot. I love it because I love to drink tea. So thanks, Mom, for that. And I'm burning the blushing amber candle from Target, which smells nice, and I'm eating some vegetable soup because I'm starving. So let's get into it. Let's pick a picture first of all, and move this. Ooh, tulips. I'm actually kind of into this, so we'll get into this tulip video. If you see like marks on the table, that is from my resin work. Resin is basically like hard plastic, so some of that is still stuck on there from my resin work. So I was doing some research about basically why as a whole, like Black people in America, we don't really have that much wealth, which in my opinion has left us vulnerable to police brutality, predatory businesses coming in. Also, it has led to basically low funding for schools, poor health care as far as what is available, and just the quality of health care, food deserts. And I was doing some research, and basically when slavery was occurring in America, Black people were basically looked at as commodities. And not only were the very rich white slave owners making money off of the free Black labor, but also they made money on insuring slaves. So there were companies that would insure slaves for like a few dollars, like $5, for a payout of about, I think, between $100 or $500 due to loss, damage, death of a slave. Of, you know, like basically like you would insure your slave like you would insure like your car or some possession, because we weren't looked at as human. So you had the wealthy white slave owners and business people building an economy off of, you know, black people. Then during slavery, soup is really good. During slavery, slaves couldn't own property, but you also had free black people who, some of whom did own property, but they couldn't, it was hard for them to pass it down because of usually inadequate paperwork. Like, for instance, they had their papers, you know, saying that they were free, usually having like their slave owners, their previous, their ex-slave owners' name, but they didn't have things that would count as far as basically letting them, what I'm trying to say, basically they didn't have a birth certificate to legitimize them holding property. Also, there weren't any wills, so there were like disputes, you know, amongst like, okay, who owns this property? Then you had post-Civil War, where you had you know, the promise of reparations, which, because of changing political figures, didn't happen. They tried to do it. They tried to give people like the 40 acres and a mule, but because, like, you know, certain political leaders were changed out, that was reneged on, and the land was given back to those previous like planters, plantation owners, who initially belonged to. But yeah, you had a lot of people, you know, basically because of conflict with the Civil War and just the lack of economic, what am I trying to say? Basically, there wasn't any real plan to economically empower ex-black slaves to be citizens, first of all, but also to economically empower them to get land. Like, for instance, during slavery, the U.S. government passed, I think it was the Homestead Act, to give land to white people. It was basically like saying, hey, white folks, go west and you can claim and develop that land. And it wasn't open really to anybody else. So white people in this country have had lots of chances as far as building up wealth due to the government basically giving them the go ahead, giving them programs and funding to do so. But the same programs and funding wasn't given to Black Americans, and much less anybody else. So post-slavery, and this was a little bit like around Jim Crow, maybe a little bit before, you did have certain cities that did have booming Black economies because those Black people were left alone. They weren't terrorized by the U.S. government or different white terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan going in and terrorizing these black people, so they were able to build up wealth. You had Black Wall Street. You had I think there was also a town in like Springfield, Illinois, and several others, like cities around the country where you had black people who had went to school or learned a trade, and you had lawyers, doctors, architects, engineers who basically built up these cities to be booming economies. Like you had, folks really having like that infrastructure. And because of white jealousy of these black people building up this economy without them, and them feeling like, how could, these black people build up this economy and we're sitting here poor. So usually what happened, it was behind the whole, like, this is not going to sound PC, but this is from my research. And, if you look at what happened historically, a lot of times it was behind some accusation that, a black man was trying to, like, assault precious white women, which is like, it goes to that like birth of the nation type of deal where, a lot of really awful laws like Jim Crow was put in because you had a movie basically saying that we need to keep, black folks under our boot, because if we let them have any humanity, basically, they'll go and rape white women. Like this, whole fear of miscegenation, of race mixing, basically. And that's goes into the topic redlining. Redlining has a lot to do why there is there's little like black wealth. And redlining was basically steered by FDR during World War II, and excuse me, I'm eating. This is really good. I'm so hungry. But yeah, FDR, who was like, and it's weird because like they always make FDR seem to be like this very progressive, liberal man who really wanted to like create a good economic foundation for America. Like he instituted such programs as like the unemployment program, Social Security, and I want to say Medicare. I could be wrong, but those two programs definitely. And he, also helped steer in the, I think like the Workers Act, where basically during the war he opened up opportunities for people, especially like artists, to like work and help build infrastructure. But FDR wasn't like this super like anti-segregationist. From what I've looked at, he was pretty much like about the status quo. He didn't want to upset like pretty much the Southern and Northern segregationists that were a part of the Democratic Party at the time. Because people, I found, don't want, basically the elite, in my opinion, they don't want the underclasses to get together, start mixing in money, and whatnot, and then questioning the status quo of the elite. So basically what happened was headed by FDR, there were programs. One is like FHA, which was like responsible for making affordable, decent houses available to white people, basically. And we're going to use, to illustrate this point, I'm going to use the color palette of redlining to illustrate my point. So you had green areas of like these metropolitan cities, and the outskirts green to denote that they were the most desirable property, and these were white affluent suburbs. You had blue, which were still desirable, but they were basically kind of like really good neighborhoods on the decent side of like town, basically. And then you had yellow, which were like declining neighborhoods in the city. And then you had red basically were areas that were in economic decay. These were the least desirable parts of the city, and basically through census data, these were areas where black people lived. And so public and private organizations use this to discriminate against black people. So if you were from this area, it was hard to get a housing loan. If you were able to get a housing loan, it was usually within the areas that were outlined in red. You couldn't, you had to basically stay in the hood. These were areas now that would be considered like the hood. Let's see, let me see if I can like go in some. And these areas usually were denied, like, and you can see it to this day if you go into certain areas, how the buildings aren't maintained. You have like a bunch of liquor stores and whatnot. It was because of redlining, basically legal discrimination to build an apartheid. And then you had white people who were able to get cheap loans that normally they, you know, in some cases they didn't even really have to pay back. So they were able to move out into the suburbs, and you know, over time their houses would accumulate value, and they were able to sell the houses for much more than they bought them, because it was like basically they bought these like, you know, decent houses for pennies on a dollar, and then they were able to pass down that wealth to their kids, and in a lot of cases get a bigger house in an even better area. So if you look at the figures currently, like the average wealth of a white family and a black family is 10 to 1. So for instance, for example, a black family would have like $17,000 as far as like saved up money, but a white family would have like over $150,000, closer to like $170,000. And it's kind of messed up because, like, as a black person in America, you've always been told the reason why, you know, if you grew up in an economically plighted area, you know, where the schools are poorly funded because the property taxes. A lot of schools are funded through property taxes, but, you know, you're told in school by your teachers, usually your black teachers, you know, how, like, you know, black people don't do this, and how, you know, it's kind of indoctrinated that, you know, the reason why it looks so bad, and, you know, is because of our culture. And as a child, it makes you kind of have this low sense of self-esteem about yourself and about being black, because you're like, man, why do I live in an area that is, you know, that looks ugly, you know, that has a lot of like gang activities, and there's not really like nice stores for me to go in, and my parks aren't well maintained. Well, that is not necessarily due to culture. That's due because it was planned that way. Basically, the United States government used redlining as a way to bolster up, at the time, like, you know, white people who didn't have that much money. They bolstered them up so they could move into the middle class, and so that black people could be a permanent underclass, because that way you don't have anybody questioning millionaires and billionaires like, hey, why are you like instilling property, like not properties, but policies and laws that only benefits other millionaires and billionaires? Because you have like the white middle class, you know, satisfied with what they have, and then you have this black underclass, you know, who you can pretty much make out to be the villains of the story. Like, oh, look at these black people, you know, they're all this crime, and, you know, all this economic plight is due because of, like, you know, their culture. But at the same time, you know, black people, we weren't afforded the opportunity to move into the middle class in mass. You had people purposely denying black people's loans based on race, even if like they had the same amount of money and like credit scores as somebody who was white, who would get that low interest loan to move out into the burbs. And even if a black family did get a loan, it was high interest. Basically, I think it might have been the FHA. They got sued in 2015 for discrimination against black people, basically. And then during like the first economic, you gotta excuse, there's a restaurant like next door, and I think the patrons are not happy. But basically, during that 2008-ish like housing market bust, a lot of black people who were homeowners, they really suffered because they had those like adjusted rate mortgages the ARM mortgages, which, like, you know, you would have a low interest rate for like the first like year or two, and then it would just inflate to this high interest. And a lot of black people lost their homes because of that. So if you look at like the data, a lot of black people, like black people as a whole, like the wealth dropped percentage points, and it hasn't been recovered. And also too, like a lot of businesses, like predatory businesses, use redlining to like put in, like, you know, advertising such as like for liquor, cigarettes before like that was like regulated. I remember seeing billboards all over where I live, well, you know, in the hood, you know, people smoking. You still see billboards of like for liquor and different, just like, you know, so-called urban advertisement, which would never fly in a middle-class suburban area. You have, like, you know, all of these like check cash places, which, you know, target black areas because of redlining. I mean, I've been reading all these articles, and I'm not necessarily articulating all the points like I want to, but I did want to like get this video out. And when you look at what redlining is and what it does, like, to me, it's like, oh wow, the US government pretty much built economic apartheid to make black people the permanent underclass, and for us never to assimilate into mainstream quote-unquote society. And the reason why is because I feel, these are my thoughts. It's easy to, you know, point to like the hood, the ghetto, whatever, these areas, and say like, wow, look at these people, you know, they're, you know, enemy number one because, you know, their culture, you know, is about violence, poverty. So, you know, elect me so that I can like help clean these streets up so it doesn't spill into the suburbs, and enact these policies. It's been used as like a leverage so that people can get elected, so that policies can get passed to more so like over police us. That's one thing too. Because of redlining, certain areas are over policed than any other areas in a metropolitan city. That's why you have things like what we've been seeing with George Floyd and other folks in the media, because it's easy for the police to come in and over police us, and for us till, you know, very recently not to have any other groups understanding and like any, like, you know, scrutiny about some of these human rights violations. Because if you have an underclass of people who look different, because that's another thing I don't think people are talking about as far as racism. It's very easy in America for people to be racist against black people because phenotypically we look very different than other groups. We have dark skin, we have different features on average. And I understand black people come in varieties of shades and colors, but it's very easy to profile a black person based on phenotype. And so what better to institute basically a system of economic apartheid than to base it off of area with a group of people that phenotypically share a lot of common traits. It's kind of messed up. So on a personal note, to me, that's why it makes a lot of sense when you, as a black person, get to a certain level and you're mostly around, like, you know, white people and other non-black people. There's a lot of hostility because it's like, well, you're supposed to be a serf in the underclass. How in the heck did you get here? So I guess, you know, yeah, also too, like, you know, redlining has been the #1 reason I feel for the poor health of black people, because you have food deserts, you have, you know, grocery stores that sells more nutritionally balanced, more nutritionally dense varieties of foods that will not come into these historically red line areas because economically they don't see any reason to, because these areas have been like basically segregated from the rest of the economy, so the economy hasn't had a chance to build up. So you have like low, like, you know, food deserts as far as like, you know, good quality food and nutrition that's available. That's why you have like you see higher rates of obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and a number of conditions due to poor diet, but also stress, because these areas are usually high crime and because they're economically depressed, and you know, there aren't, like, you know, a lot of psychiatry and psychologists that are available, you know, to talk to in redline areas. And also there's a lot of mental illness that goes unchecked, unfortunately, in drug use, because, you know, you don't really have an economy set up. So a lot of black market economies pop up, such as drug dealing, prostitution, bootlegging, and a number of other, like, you know, economies, which, you know, a lot of rap has like, you know, it's been a subject of, like, you know, a lot of rap, which people love, including white people, but it comes from being in economically deprived areas. You know, it comes out of racist policies. So am I just like complaining about it and being a bitter Betty? No. Honestly, doing the research and reading about redlining, it gave me clarity about why things are the way they are. Why do, like, you know, as a whole, white people, especially in the middle class, feel so much superior towards a lot of black people? Why a lot of black people have such low self-esteem? Why there aren't really booming economies in a lot of black areas. And also why this has been held from schools. Like, I didn't learn about redlining in school and the real the realities of it, that was probably on purpose. Also, like, a lot of people don't really understand the effects of redlining, and I think if they did, things would be different. Like, it's in a way, it's given me clarity about personally how I need to reframe a lot of things so that I more so think about economic prosperity. It also gives me tools to kind of deal with the superiority complex that a lot of white people hold in this country. And it's not like, ooh, yeah, now I hate white people. No. It makes sense why certain people have attitudes that the way that they do, and it gives me clarity how to move about in the world. So I feel that as a whole, black people, we need to be focused on building economically, as far as building viable businesses that can be passed down to our generation, so that we have an economic foundation. So when there are instances of police brutality, we can hire well-trained lawyers to sue these different police departments and municipalities. Also too, to be able to fund people who want to go to law school, medical school, who want to be entrepreneurs. We need to be thinking more so on an economic basis as a group to build our group up. Also too, it makes sense why for the most part America is so segregated. It's because it was built like that. Because if you had different groups of people living in the same neighborhoods as each other, growing up with each other, you would see more people having relationships and mixing, and not only creating more mixed race people, but also you will be mixing money, and that is a threat to the powers that be, I feel. So it's one of those things where I feel like researching this topic has just more so giving me clarity on why things are the way that they are. And also too, it has started to, for me personally, not to kind of clear up some of this, some of the low self-esteem that is easy to feel as a black person in this country. Because for me, I felt as man, why aren't we doing better as a group? And then me being a older millennial, going on the internet, and you just see all of these disgusting things said about black people. And there's been people who have made entire movements based on just propaganda about like, oh, why do black people have low IQs? Why, why is there like high crime in the black community? Blah 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 blah. And understanding that we've been made as a permanent underclass so that we can be used as political tools to enact fear, and also like galvanize power to like certain people who want to get seen, as far as politically. It's a game. It's basically game. Ew. So, yeah. I remember talking about this topic with my counselor. And my counselor, she's Asian. And she was asking me, as, someone who's not black, how can non-black folks basically be allies? And I had to think about that, and I came up with like basically 2 points that made sense to me. I told her, first of all, if you want to be an ally, fight against the terrorism that's state deemed against black people, by the police, and these policies that really punish black folks unfairly. Then also fight for black people to get reparations. I feel like America really owes the descendants of black slaves reparations. We have helped build this country. And I told her, I was like, if those 2 points, if that makes people feel like, kind of uncomfortable or a certain type of way, then maybe they need to look inside and look at maybe some of the anti-black sentiments that they have, because it's really like a matter of human rights. I feel, this country has had a really big human rights issue as far as black people are concerned, and they've never been called out on. And I feel like now it's the opportunity to really put America to task for it, instead of, all of this, like, what I feel is virtue signaling by folks. Like, really fight for, not everybody, but there's a lot of virtue signaling going on. Like, I don't want to see no Black Lives Matter, like Coca-Cola bottle or whatever like that. I want to see companies, organizations fighting for black people to get reparations in this country, because we are way overdue for it. Also to fight against all of the over-policing and stop militarizing the police, and because, there's also a lot of police that are part of, like, basically white power organizations, and that's a problem. Like, there was once upon a time where, you know, you had politicians and police and firefighters a part of the Ku Klux Klan proud, and the police they have a legacy of that, and that really needs to be dismantled. So yeah, I had to pause in between just because I didn't want this video to be so long. But in the next video, maybe I'll do just like a watercolor picture inspired by this topic. Also, you know, these topics, I don't want to talk about like race like all the time. I just don't want to put myself in a box, but this has been on my mind lately. So yes, and we're finished with our little illustration. So yeah, maybe I'll leave some like informative links that helped inform me about the topic. So yeah, but yeah, that's our little picture inspired by redlining. Thanks for coloring with me. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.